Good evening. Good evening. I would like to welcome everyone to the webinar entitled The State of California Requirements, Overview of the California Environmental Quality Act, also known as Ceqa, in relation to cannabis operations, hosted by the City of Los Angeles's Department of Cannabis Regulation. My name is Frank Louie with the Cal Asian Chamber of Commerce, and I will be moderating tonight's event. Before we get started, let's take a moment to review some housekeeping rules. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and can be viewed after the editing process on DCR's website. You will be muted with cameras off for the duration of the webinar. This means that your camera and audio function will not be available to you during this session. However, you will be able to see and hear all the panelists. There is an open chat box where you can interact with one another for networking or comment on the information. Please use caution when sharing personal information in the public forum and keep your questions focused on tonight's topic. And please ask questions about tonight's subject matter in the Q&A box. We are gathering and responding to your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll have a Q&A session where you will get responses in the last 15 minutes of tonight's event. You are all encouraged to utilize the Q&A box at the bottom of your pane of your Zoom screen. If you use the Q&A box for questions, everyone will be able to see the questions when they are answered. Finally, please note that the current content presented tonight was not created by the Department of Cannabis Regulation or the City of Los Angeles and is for informational purposes only. This information is subject to change and does not replace or supersede the Los Angeles Municipal Code nor constitute legal advice. If you have specific questions outside of tonight's topic, please call 213-978-0738 during business hours to speak to a DCR representative. Now let's transition to the presentation. I'd like to introduce our speaker from the California Department of Cannabis Control, Caitlin Hengveld. Caitlin is a senior environmental scientist supervisor at the Department of Cannabis Control. She began working at Cal Cannabis in 2017, which I think for most of you remember, it was under CDFA or Food and Ag, and moved into leadership at the Department of Cannabis Control in 2021. Caitlin oversees the Environmental Evaluation Unit that reviews the environmental component of manufacturing, retail, distribution, microbusiness, and testing lab applications and licenses. Since beginning her tenure at Cal Cannabis, Caitlin has worked to develop the state's coordination with local jurisdictions in regards to identifying Ceqa compliance processes for state licensure. Welcome, Caitlin. Thank you for joining us, and please start your presentation. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. While I'm sharing my screen. All right. Welcome to an overview of the California Environmental Quality Act in relation to cannabis operations. Like Frank introduced myself, my name is Caitlin Hengveld, and I'm the Senior Environmental Scientist Supervisor that oversees the environmental reviews of non-cultivation activity types. I will caveat that it does include micro businesses, so I slightly overlap with cultivation activities. This evening, I will be going to be providing a high-level overview of Ceqa compliance in relation to commercial cannabis businesses. I'm going to do my best to break this down into some digestible nuggets that you can take away from this presentation, and I will try to make it as entertaining as possible for the content of Ceqa. But if you're familiar with Ceqa, the application of it to commercial cannabis businesses is ever so slightly different than some of the typical application processes you see in other permitting activities. It tends to be due to the requirements that have been incorporated into statute and regulation for commercial cannabis businesses. And please be aware that this presentation is not intended to provide any application-specific recommendations or to act in any way as a consultation in regard to a specific business or application activity. This presentation is going to be a high-level overview of Ceqa, and none of the examples are intended to be a recommendation for any business in particular or activity type. The DCC works in coordination with each local jurisdiction, whether that's as a city or a county, when issuing annual state licenses. Please continue to work with your specific local jurisdiction prior to possibly hiring a Ceqa consultant, having any environmental or biological surveys done, or preparing a project description, as your local permitting agency will provide you with the directions that you need on how and what you need to provide to move forward with your local permitting process and receive that Ceqa compliant documentation that you will then provide as part of your state application process. So what is the California Environmental Quality Act, also known as Ceqa? This word gets thrown around a lot in terms of cannabis licensing, but Ceqa is an state regulation that requires public agencies to consider the environmental consequences of their discretionary actions. This may include issuing a conditional use permit or a land use permit. Ceqa is intended to inform government decision makers and the public about potential environmental effects of proposed activities and to prevent significant avoidable environmental damage. More information on Ceqa can be found at the state's Office and Planning Research website, which is on the screen. There are numerous pages at this website on the background of Ceqa and its applicability. They also have links to the Ceqa guidelines, which goes over the implementation of Ceqa. Right, so now that we have a background of what Ceqa is, what is the purpose of Ceqa? There are numerous intentions for the implementation of Ceqa, but we can think of it as a way to prevent or reduce environmental impacts, disclose decisions, promote interagency coordination, and encourage public participation in local doings. To prevent or reduce environmental impact, the lead agency will review a project proposal and need to identify any possible significant environmental impacts of said proposed project prior to its consideration and approval to move forward. If Ceqa is applicable to a project, the lead agency will identify ways to prevent or reduce impacts by requiring consideration of feasible project alternatives or adoption of mitigation measures. If significant impacts are identified, the lead agency prepares what are called findings or a statement of overriding consideration to fully disclose to the public or other permitting agencies why involved agencies approved that project with those possible impacts. During this process, lead, responsible, and trustee agencies assist each other in understanding the potential environmental impacts associated with a proposed project, leading to interagency coordination. Depending on the document prepared, there may be a required public noticing period. Public noticing provides opportunities for the public to comment on a proposed development before it's approved. The public may participate in a project's overall planning in ways such as scoping meetings, receipt of public notice, preparing comment letters in response to a project, or even initiating legal enforcement procedures. For example, a real life Ceqa process in action that myself I've encountered. I live within the city of Sacramento, and in my neighborhood, I live in the suburbs. Recently, we were publicly notified of a new housing development proposal nearby. I live near some land that's currently zoned for agricultural uses. They're actively being farmed, but they're proposing to rezone it and build a housing development. And the land that they're proposing to develop is nesting ground for what are known as Swinson hawks, which are listed as threatened species under the California Endangered Species Act. They nest out there in the agriculture land on the ground, just informationally. So Ceqa requires mitigating the loss of that habitat for these species and requiring the public to be notified of building proposals that may result in significant impacts. This allows people located within the vicinity of the project to actively participate in the jurisdiction's decision prior to approving that project. So for example, for the one located near me, there are scoping meetings that we're able to attend. You can also provide public commenting during that noticing period. And we're able to just make it known how we as neighbors feel about this project that's going to be going in, possibly if approved. So who determines whether a project is subject to Ceqa and what document will be prepared? There are a number of decision makers involved in this process, and their involvement occurs at different times. Two of the main parties necessary for commercial cannabis operators are a lead agency and a responsible agency. The lead agency has the primary responsibility for determining the level of CEQA review required for a project and for preparing and approving the appropriate document. A responsible agency under CEQA is a public agency that has some discretionary authority over a project or a portion of it, but they have not been designated as the lead agency. A responsible agency is allowed to rely on the CEQA document prepared by the lead agency to meet their CEQA compliance requirements. A responsible agency may comply with CEQA by considering the EIR or negative declaration prepared by the lead agency and by reaching its own conclusion on whether and how the project, how to approve the project that's being involved. Okay. So DCC can act either as a responsible or a lead agency, depending on discussion with the local jurisdiction and also the local jurisdiction's ordinances. The DCC will not take on the lead role of lead agency without first discussing the licensing process with the local jurisdiction. Generally, DCC acts as a lead agency when a local jurisdiction's program is ministerial, and we will act as a responsible agency where a local jurisdiction's program is discretionary. Throughout most of California, DCC acts as a responsible agency, as most commercial cannabis programs at the local level are discretionary, and the local jurisdictions, whether it's the city or county, takes on that responsibility of being lead agency. Okay. So what is the difference between a discretionary and ministerial determination? A discretionary project requires the public agency to exercise judgment in determining if a project will be approved or prior to issuing a permit. A conditional use permit is an example of a discretionary type permit. A discretionary type permit may be required because of a proposal to modify a previous conforming use, a deviation from local zoning requirements, and the project may be located in an environmentally sensitive area, or development may be located within a historical resource. A ministerial project is one that requires only conformance to a fixed standard and requires little to no judgment by a public official. A ministerial request would be reviewed to determine that a request complies with a set of codified standards. Okay, so that leads us to, how is this applicable to your cannabis business? So DCC's annual licensing process is a discretionary determination on behalf of the department as set forth in the California Code of Regulations and the State Business and Professions Code. DCC is not required to issue a license and can adopt regulations or can impose conditions to the issuance of the license to mitigate potential harmful environmental effects. Event type licenses are excluded from CEQA compliance requirements in regulation for DCC licensing. To ensure CEQA obligations are met, DCC's regulations require an annual license applicant to provide evidence of exemption from or compliance with CEQA. This means that regardless of the cannabis activity type, all commercial cannabis licenses issued by the DCC, excluding events, will be subject to CEQA. Whether that evaluation is completed at a local level or the state level is determined by a combination of the local ordinance and whether the local permitting process is discretionary or ministerial, and through coordination between the state and the local jurisdiction. Okay. Now that we know that commercial cannabis activity is subject to CEQA, whether that's done at the local or state level, how does the lead agency determine what type of CEQA document is prepared for a site? What you see on the screen is a very distilled version of the steps that are gone through and required, whether that includes additional public scoping, public commenting, working with what are called trustee agencies. The Department of Fish and Wildlife is a trustee agency, or possibly taking other steps necessary in determining potential impacts of a project. For the sake of time, we're only going to go over the steps identified on this slide, but the first step would be for the lead agency to determine if the project qualifies for an exemption. This would include reviewing the provided project description and project details, such as if there's hazardous substances on site, if the location would modify a historical resource, or if there's going to be construction activities that will occur as part of the project. As growing cannabis can be a resource-intensive activity, the lead agency should also look at the potential water and energy consumption for the operational activity. If all requirements are met to exempt a project, then the determination would be adopted, and typically a notice of exemption will be filed with either the state clearinghouse or the county clerk's office. If a notice of exemption, or we typically call that an NOE, is filed, it will trigger a 35-day statute of limitations for challenging the agency's determination that the project is exempt. If an NOE is not filed, the time period to challenge the action under Ceqa is 180 days following the agency's approval. While an NOE is not required to be filed with the state clearinghouse or county clerk's office under Ceqa law, DCC has written it into our regulations that for a state application requires a signed and filed NOE for the issuance of an annual license when the project has been determined to be exempted. If a project does not fall under exemption, the lead agency will then take on the preparation of an initial study, or what's called an IS for short. An initial study is a preliminary analysis conducted by the lead agency to determine if a project may have a significant effect on the environment. The initial study looks at long-term impacts, short-term construction-related impacts, direct and indirect impacts, as well as cumulative impacts of similar projects located nearby. The initial study can aid in determining what type of environmental document is then to be prepared. The initial study aids in the preparation of a document in the following ways. An initial study would identify non-significant effects of the project. An initial study allows the lead agency to focus on potentially significant effects for each resource evaluated. While there's no set specific template for initial study, typically there are 20 resources that are evaluated as part of an initial study. Resources evaluated under Ceqa include items such as greenhouse gas emissions, traffic impacts of the project, the operational energy use of a project, noise impacts, and air quality. The list goes on. Like I said, there's about 20 of those resource sections that are evaluated as part of an initial study. An initial study should also explain the reasons for determining why the potential environmental effects would not be significant. Initial study would also identify the appropriate type of environmental document that would be prepared. So the initial study, as it evaluates those resource sections, that is where potentially significant and unavoidable impacts would be identified for those resource sections. So if the initial study determines that there's no substantial evidence that the project may cause significant effect on the environment, the lead agency will prepare what's called a negative declaration, or an ND. If the initial study identifies potentially significant adverse effects on the environment, but with revisions to the project plans or proposals, it would avoid the effects or mitigate the effects so that no significant impacts would occur, then what's called a mitigated negative declaration would be prepared, or MND. And for these, sometimes they're seen as mitigation monitoring reporting plans in addition to the initial study. If it's determined that there are potentially significant impacts on the environment resulting from the project that can't be mitigated, the lead agency would then prepare an environmental impact report, or EIR. So as stated earlier, these steps in determining what document to be prepared is a very high-level version of implementing the Ceqa guidelines, and there may need to be additional steps taken through the process depending on site-specific details. So during this process is when public noticing would happen, and the lead agency would work with the identified responsible and trustee agencies for the determination of an exempted project. There are no public notifying requirements. This would only occur once an initial study is completed and possibly a higher level document would need to be prepared for a site. Okay, so on the screen are the most common types of documents that the DCC receives for commercial cannabis sites. Categorical exemptions are one of the most prevalent determinations that we see made. Categorical exemptions are created through a regulatory process, and you can find all of them in the Ceqa guidelines, sections 15300 through 15333. So the Ceqa guideline defines the types of projects and activities eligible for each class of categorical exemptions. The guideline also lists exceptions that apply to all or certain classes of exemptions. Categorical exemption will generally not apply if there's a reasonable possibility of significant impact on the environment due to unusual circumstances. There's no definition of what an unusual circumstance is, and so it can be anything from an extremely high energy usage if a site is going from, for example, a retailer that uses 80,000 kilowatts hours per year to now they're using over 6 million kilowatt hours per year. That might be considered in unusual circumstances just due to the hike in energy usage. It could possibly be due to significant cumulative impacts from projects of the same type that will result, or the project will impact a uniquely sensitive environment. And those uniquely sensitive environment could be areas with like riparian zones or possibly as habitat for a threatened or endangered species. The exceptions to the exemption can be found in section 15300.2 of the Ceqa guidelines. So consequently, projects normally eligible for an exemption may not be eligible if certain circumstances exist or would exist with the implementation of the project. So for example, if a proposed project were to modify a historically designated building, or the site was previously contaminated by a hazardous substance and is now identified on what's called the Cortese list, which is managed by the Department of Toxic Substance Control, the site may not be eligible for a categorical exemption because those are both considered exceptions to the exemption that would exclude them from being determined categorically exempt. If you have a cultivation application or you're going to be a cultivation applicant, the Cortese list may actually be familiar to you. It's identified on the same website as EnviroStore. And as part of the cultivation application process, DCC requires a screenshot of your premises address on EnviroStore, which would identify if there are any hazardous substances located on your site. Okay, so please be aware that a site determination cannot be made until a lead agency reviews a complete site-specific project description, as they're required to do their due diligence under Ceqa. This is the same process whether the site is categorically exempted or if there would be a need for another Ceqa document to be prepared. So even if you feel like your site qualifies for a certain type of document, you're still required to provide a complete project description for the lead agency to evaluate. The lead agency may request additional information necessary to fully evaluate your project and make that Ceqa determination. A project that is exempted does not have a significant effect on the environment and are exempted from requiring the preparation of any other environmental documents. The 6 categorical exemptions listed on the screen are the ones that DCC has identified as most likely to be applicable to cannabis operations. This does not exclude any of the other categorical exemptions from applying to your site. These are just the ones that we most commonly see. And just be aware your site may also have more than one categorical exemption determination applied to your project. So as we go through, as I talked about the sections for categorical exemptions, so section 15301, that last number in that section is the class that we refer to. So 15301 would be a class 1 exemption, which relates to existing facilities. So that would be, for example, a retailer going into an existing strip mall. There are, if you look at the Ceqa guidelines, there are a set of guidelines, as they're called, that applies to each of these categorical exemptions and additional requirements that they have to meet in terms of it has to be smaller than a certain square footage for existing facilities, what was the previous use. So it's not as simple as it's going into an existing building. There are a few other requirements that apply to each of these categorical exemptions. So then we move on to the class 2 exemption, which is for the replacement or reconstruction activities. So for example, if you needed to replace the collapsed facade of a building, this could possibly qualify for a class 2 exemption. A class 3 would be for new construction or conversion of small structures. Then we have our class 4 exemptions, which are minor alterations to land. This would be, for example, if you're landscaping or you need to repave your parking lot, this could possibly apply for that. The class 11 relates to accessory structures. An accessory structure would be something like, for example, building a garage onto your house would be an accessory structure. Then we have class 11, which, oh wait, that was accessory structures. Then we have class 32, which is used for infill development projects. This is another one that has a few additional requirements to it, but for example, this would be building a 2,000 square foot warehouse on a 2-acre empty lot within an urban city. This is where you provide a project description and then the lead agency would then make sure that it fits within each of these categorical exemption requirements. So for example, class 32, it can't apply if the site is over 5 acres in size. So there are some limitations to make sure that a project fits within each class of exemption. Other documents that we see, for example, are initial studies and mitigated negative declarations, or ISMNDs for short. You'll always see the initial study along with the determination. So for example, the mitigated negative declaration. We also see initial studies and negative declarations and also environmental impact reports. I didn't include it, but some of the other documents we may see are addendas to an initial study mitigated neg dec or an EIR. So for example, if a programmatic document is prepared for a jurisdiction, when it comes time for that site-specific determination, we could see an addenda prepared that includes a site-specific update as far as what that project is doing for a location. So that would be called an addenda. So DCC attempts to coordinate with all permissive jurisdictions on their Ceqa compliance for commercial cannabis operators. DCC has coordinated with over 200 local jurisdictions, which include both cities and counties throughout the state of California to identify their annual state licensing pathways. And just this past year in 2022, we spoke to individual jurisdictions regarding their state licensing process over 2,200 times. So we keep busy making sure that our licensing pathways align with each of the jurisdictions. So during these discussions with each jurisdiction, the lead agency for the preparation of Ceqa compliant documents is also identified, whether that will be the DCC or the local jurisdiction is preparing those documents. DCC also attempts to identify what documents the local jurisdiction will be or has prepared, so that when our environmental staff reach out to applicants to ask for additional information or ask for documents that weren't provided, we ensure that we tailor our request to each jurisdiction, as each jurisdiction is a little bit different, whether they prepare staff reports and notices of exemption or development agreements, conditional use permits, resolutions. We see all kinds of different documents, so we want to ensure that we're asking you for the correct document that was prepared, hopefully to limit some of the confusion that comes with Ceqa. Okay, so for commercial cannabis businesses within the city of Los Angeles, the city will be completing the preparation of your Ceqa compliant documentation as part of the local permitting process. Please continue to work with the Department of Cannabis Regulation to receive your local permit if you are located within the city of LA. As you go through your local permitting process, you'll be notified of the steps to take to become compliant with Ceqa. For example, providing your project description of your commercial cannabis activity as part of your local permit application. The local permitting agency will evaluate the project description provided to make a determination for Ceqa based on site-specific analysis. To reiterate what I mentioned before, the lead agency is responsible for making the site determination for Ceqa compliance. The lead agency or responsible agency may not make a predetermination for a site without evaluating the project details. The local and DCC must complete their due diligence under Ceqa when making that discretionary determination. So sometimes when you reach out to DCC or possibly your local jurisdiction, it can be a little frustrating because we can't provide you 100% clarity as far as what document will be prepared for your site. But that's because we're trying to do our due diligence. We need to review that complete project description for your site. And we need to understand what is going on specifically before we make that determination. All right, I think everything came up on that slide. So this flow chart identifies how an application moves through the DCC review process. The environmental review, or more commonly known as the Ceqa review, is only a small portion of that application review that is completed at the DCC. So as we go through this chart, your application is not submitted until DCC to DCC until the application fee is paid. That is that first step. DCC will then reach out to the local jurisdiction to verify the local compliance and that a business is eligible for a state license. Once your eligibility is verified, the application then moves into the administrative review process. This is where background checks are completed, right to occupy documents are verified, and surety bonds are reviewed. Once the administrative review is complete, the application then moves into the scientific review. Depending on the application submitted will dictate the documents that are reviewed at this time. For example, cultivation applications are required to provide a copy of power bills or evidence of enrollment in the cannabis general order with the state water boards. Whereas if you're applying for a retail license, for example, only a Ceqa compliant documentation would be reviewed at that point. Once the administrative review and the scientific review are complete, the application is then recommended for licensure. The license is then issued upon payment of the license fee. DCC frequently receives questions during this process. So I wanted to additionally go over some of the most common questions that we receive. And some of these are directly from City of LA applicants. So hopefully these are applicable to you as well. Why does the one question we get frequently is, why does the state licensing process take so long? And why can't DCC give me a timeline as far as how long it will take to review the application? So there are three main components, as you can see on the screen, as part of the state application process. There are four if you have a testing lab application in. The first piece would be to verify the local compliance with the local jurisdiction. The local verification unit reaches out to each jurisdiction to verify the status. If as part of your application, you provided a local permit ahead of time, you can upload that into your application package and it would shorten it to a 10-day outreach turnaround. If a local permit is not provided, the time frame for the jurisdiction to respond may be up to 60 days. So it adds a bit of time to that. The second component is the administrative and business review. During this review, like I talked about, this is when owner applications are reviewed, right to occupy documents, surety bonds, possibly premises diagrams as well, depending on the application type. If all documents are not provided, a deficiency is issued by the department, and an applicant has 180 days to respond and provide all required documents. Once it clears that administrative review, the third component is the environmental evaluation. Most people associate this with the Ceqa analysis, but depending on the type of application, there may be additional documentation reviewed during this portion. For example, cultivation applications also require a lake or stream bed alteration agreement or written verification that a lake or stream bed alteration agreement is not required from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. You're also required to provide evidence of enrollment in the Cannabis General Order from the State Water Resources Control Board, along with water and power information. And I do want to clarify these requirements. All cultivation requirements are also required for micro businesses that have cultivation activity included within them. So that may increase your application time for a micro business as well. Then we have our manufacturing applications, which also require additional documents in addition to the Ceqa compliance documents. So depending on the type of manufacturing activity that you're doing, you may also be required to provide a closed loop certificate and product quality protocols. And I would like to caveat that one as well. Micro businesses, if you're doing manufacturing activity underneath a micro business, has the same exact application review requirements as if you had submitted a manufacturing application. So for example, if you're submitting a micro business application that includes cultivation, manufacturing, and retail, you'll be required to provide all the documents for cultivation, all of the documents required for a manufacturing application, and then that environmental document will be required to cover cultivation, manufacturing, and retail activity type. If during the environmental review, any documentation is determined to be missing, you'll be issued a deficiency and the applicant will have another 180 days to provide the required documents. It's not on the screen, but if someone is applying for a testing lab, between the administrative review and the scientific review, there's also a testing lab review, during which time standard operating protocols or SOPs are reviewed by the DCC lab division. And then this review process itself has another 180-day deficiency period if a complete application isn't provided. So as we go through each of these steps in the process, there's a large number of variables that make it difficult for DCC to provide a time frame for how long it will take an application to be reviewed by staff. So a way to limit this is to provide a complete application package to the DCC, and it will help us effectively review your application. So then another question we receive is, what is the difference between the local licensing verification and Ceqa local verification? So the licensing local verification like we talked about on this step, is the third piece right there, that local verification. This is to ensure that an applicant is compliant with the local ordinances and able to apply for a state license. The scientific review or Ceqa review doesn't actually require local verification outreach. The environmental review process follows the licensing pathways we identify as we work with each jurisdiction to identify what documentation that they've prepared for their Ceqa compliance. If DCC staff requests a document or a letter during the Ceqa review, that document has previously been discussed with the local jurisdiction as either proof of Ceqa compliance underway for currently only our equity applicants to receive a provisional license, or we've worked with the jurisdiction and the lead agency to identify the final documents that will need to be provided. Sometimes we understand that Ceqa compliance is difficult and it's not understood by everyone. And so sometimes we get questions of why can't you just work with my jurisdiction directly? And do you know why my jurisdiction hasn't provided that document that I need? And to that end, DCC coordinates with all the local jurisdictions within the state of California to identify what we call licensing pathways. And so each of those pathways identifies what documentation the jurisdiction prepared for their applicants to provide to DCC as part of their state application package. So yes, more than likely the DCC has already spoken with your local jurisdiction and identified what documentation that we need. So if a DCC environmental scientist directs an applicant to reach back out to their jurisdiction requesting a specific document, it's because we have an understanding with that jurisdiction that they will be completing or preparing the Ceqa compliant documentation for the applicant to provide to DCC. DCC wouldn't send applicants back to their local jurisdictions if we had not already discussed that process with them. We attempt to request all documentation by its name that's given by the jurisdiction, whether it'll be a staff report, NOE, conditional use permit, resolution. Like I said, there's a lot of variables in what each jurisdiction calls a specific document, but we work directly with the jurisdiction, so we will attempt to call it by what the jurisdiction has named it to eliminate as much confusion as possible. And then in terms of equity, one of the questions we get frequently is what is the difference between a local equity applicant and a DCC equity applicant? The local equity applicant approval is the verification that DCC uses to verify that somebody is an equity applicant. To be approved as an equity applicant for a state license, you must be enrolled in your local jurisdiction's equity program. This may get confused with the equity fee waiver application, which is a completely separate process with the DCC and does not require somebody to have local equity status when you apply for that with the DCC. So to apply for the equity fee waiver, you would submit a form DCC 1601 as part of your application package requesting that fee waiver. And if you have any questions about being identified as an equity applicant or that equity fee waiver application, I apologize, I didn't advance my screen to our email addresses, but this one isn't on there, so I will spell it out for everyone. But please reach out to our equity unit, which is equity, EQUITY, at cannabis.ca.gov. With any questions about whether or not you qualify as an equity applicant, or if you have questions about that equity fee waiver application. You can also find the form required for the equity fee waiver application on our DCC website as well. Okay. And then another question that we get a lot is why have the review processes changed now, specifically when it comes to manufacturing or these non-cultivation activities for retail or distribution. In terms of why are the regulations so stringent compared to what they were in the past? Possibly you had a friend or a neighbor that applied, and it might have been a little different when they got their license. But this comes from, I'm going to provide a little history at the moment of DCC's consolidation from our 3 legacy agencies. So back in 2021, July of 2021, when the Bureau of Cannabis Control, so BCC, the Manufactured Cannabis Safety Branch under CDPH, and then Cal Cannabis all became one department. There were a lot of processes that needed to be aligned. And one of the major pieces to be aligned was the environmental evaluation. And so I've been part of this process since the consolidation, and we've worked to align and ensure that the environmental documents are reviewed exactly the same, no matter what type of activity that you're going to be operating. And so with that, it may seem like our regulations have changed, but what's actually happening is that we've aligned our processes. And now, whether you're a cultivation license or a retail applicant or a manufacturing applicant, the DCC environmental scientists are reviewing your Ceqa compliance documents with the same standard across the board. And so we've established this review process to ensure that all applications meet our regulatory requirements for annual licensure. So this is everything I have to present today. I understand we're going to have a Q&A after this. I do on the screen have a slide if there's any questions in the future. If you have general licensing questions, you can contact our licensing inbox at licensing@cannabis.ca.gov. If you do have any project specific or Ceqa related questions, you can reach out to our unit, and an environmental scientist will respond to you at our environmental review at cannabis.ca.gov. You can also sign up for any email updates at our website, which is cannabis.ca.gov, and they will preemptively send you any updates, regulations, or changes within the department as well. But I will hop back to you, Frank, for us to get to our Q&A session.
Yeah. Thank you, Caitlin. A lot of information there, and thank you for trying to unpack that. And I think that last slide too has good references to resources. So very important. So let's handle a couple of these questions that have been submitted. But before we do that, can you just re-summarize the discretionary versus ministerial determination? Just restate that again. I just want to make sure that was
for discretionary versus ministerial projects, whether the locals or DCC is the lead agency would depend on the local ordinance and how the local permitting is set up. So if the local permitting process and ordinances are set up in a way that the permit is a discretionary determination, a discretionary action or project would mean that there's some kind of discretionary review, meaning that a license or permit doesn't necessarily have to be issued. Somebody reviews that proposed project and makes a determination to issue a permit, possibly a conditional use permit or a land use permit. That would make a project discretionary and then applicable to Ceqa. Whereas a ministerial project is one that only has to meet a set of codified requirements. Essentially, someone just has to look at a checkbox and say, okay, you submitted your application, you have your permit. And these are possibly, they may be called like a by right permit for something that doesn't need a change of use or a conditional use permit.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, a couple questions. And you hit a lot of these, but I think it's just important to kind of restate them or re-clarify. What is a lead agency? Was one of the questions submitted.
So the lead agency is the public agency that would determine whether or not a project is approved. So they're going to be the ones that prepare that Ceqa document or Ceqa compliant document and issue a permit based on that.
Okay. And then another question, what is a project description?
So project description, that's where it all comes down to, is as part of your process, whether the local jurisdiction is the lead agency or the DCC is the lead agency, you'll need to submit a project description so that we can evaluate what will be happening on site and make that determination. For DCC, and I believe it's very similar for DCR's process as well. Our project description requirements are in our regulations. So anyone can go look at our regulations. It's section 15010. And it outlines what pieces of information that will need to be provided as part of your project description. For example, is there a waterway on your site? What is the land zone for? So ask some pretty general questions. What is going to be happening as part of your project activities? Is there construction on site? So typically DCC has some templates, and I'm sure DCR as part of their permitting process will have some templates. Don't quote me on that if I'm talking out of turn, but they should have that information, what they're going to request as part of their project description, so that they can use to evaluate and determine whether a site's categorically exempted or if additional Ceqa documentation will need to be prepared.
Okay, great. Another question came in. Who do I need to contact regarding Ceqa compliance for my site?
If at any time an applicant that's applying for a state cannabis license is unsure whether DCC or their local jurisdiction will be acting as lead agency, they can reach out to our environmental review at cannabis.ca.gov, and we can point you in the right direction who will be the lead agency for your jurisdiction. For the city of Los Angeles specifically, you'd want to reach out to the DCR as they're the lead agency, and they will be preparing the Ceqa compliance documents. But if you happen to be in another jurisdiction listening to this, feel free to reach out to the DCC and we can point you in the right direction.
Great. Yeah, and Mitchell submitted, I don't know if you can answer this one, but interesting question. Will any part of Ceqa compliance change with the passage of SB 54 and its new requirements for plastic recycling, or does Ceqa not consider waste?
I don't know of that one specifically. Typically, off the top of my head and off the cuff, we look at hazardous waste. But I might need to get back to you on that. I think I'd like to see the question. I can provide a more thorough response to that.
Yeah, we'll share that with you, and then you can see if find out or research or point us in the right direction. We'll get Mitchell a resource there. And I don't know if this is necessarily related to your Ceqa, but maybe just in general, do DCC fees have to be paid by 3/31? That was Rakija sent that in.
Correct me if I'm wrong, whoever asked this question. So just to kind of unpack this, if you're applying as an equity applicant to possibly receive a provisional state license, you'll need to submit and pay for your application by 3/31 to possibly be eligible for a provisional license. If you were just to submit an annual application to go through the DCC state licensing process, that is not required, but I believe they're asking about that equity deadline for applications.
I think so. I think you covered it. And I know that there was a notice that went out that it's actually been modified to April 3rd just because of the holiday, but that went out through kind of public notice from DCC, and I think even the DCR had published that out. You'll see that on the websites for those that you can access those websites to clarify. But I think you're correct there. And then this isn't kind of, this is kind of generic in one sense. Why is my project discretionary? Maybe you kind of covered that, but that was a question that was submitted. Why is my project discretionary?
Yeah, so if you're familiar with Ceqa, there's possibly to be ministerial or discretionary as part of local permitting processes. However, those local ordinances are developed. But DCC, when our statutes went into place and our regulations, it was determined that all state licensing is a discretionary action on behalf of the department. And so whether the local jurisdiction acts as a lead agency or not, the issuance of a state annual license is a discretionary determination on behalf of DCC. So as we talked about in the presentation, making that discretionary determination, DCC would either act as a responsible agency or the lead agency. But regardless of who acts as lead or responsible, lead in that instance, DCC's issuance of an annual license is a discretionary determination.
Great, great. And then another question, are there other agencies that I need to work with?
Yes, depending on the type of license that you're submitting. So like I talked about there at the end, cultivation licenses require you to also work with the Department of Fish and Wildlife and then also possibly the Water Board. This may also depend where your application or your premises site is located, depending on what type of documentation that you need from either of those agencies. So for example, if you did need a lake or stream bed alteration agreement for your site, that document comes into play when a Ceqa determination is made. And also a Ceqa determination would be made for the issuance of a lake or stream bed alteration agreement. So if your premises is located within an urban area or a city and you don't need one, you would still need to go through the Department of Fish and Wildlife and get what's called a written verification that a lake and stream bed alteration agreement is not needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why, yeah, jurisdiction by jurisdiction is so uniquely different because it's, you know, urban versus rural and so on and so forth, right? Some things apply and some things don't. It's not cookie cutter, right? Yeah.
No.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And then next question, what is the process for determining if an exemption applies to a project?
So just the high level overview of that is the lead agency would get a project description, and as they evaluate that, they would determine what exemptions apply to that. So for example, we didn't go into them, but possibly they're common sense exemptions or the general rule or statutory exemptions, or we focus a lot on categorical exemptions. I kind of touched on it for each of them. So for example, a class 1 exemption, which was the existing facilities. If you were to look in the Ceqa guidelines, there's a set of some baseline guidance of what kind of projects would apply or fit into a class 1 exemption, whether the previous use of the facility was similar, whether it's within a certain size, are they doing construction activity? So there's a few check boxes that need to be met to ensure that a project fits within an exemption and if it applies to the project.
Okay, great, thank you. And then as we kind of get close to our time here, in what circumstances is preparation of an environmental impact report required?
So an environmental impact required is, or an environmental impact report would be required in instances where an initial study is completed and there's significant and unavoidable impacts that can't be mitigated. And so that is when an environmental impact report would be prepared.
Okay. And then last question from the audience, what is the required content for a notice of exemption?
So there is no set format for a notice of exemption, and it varies slightly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. We see kind of different formats. Typically, it follows a very similar one, and you can see that on OPR's website. That was in the very first slide that I presented. They have an example template there, but typically a jurisdiction will make it their own. They will add a brief project description, what type of exemption the project qualifies for, and then they will put in a basis of why the project is exempt and that none of those exceptions to the exemptions apply. As a responsible agency, when we review those notices of exemption, if they're very robust and they provide a robust project description that we can rely on and ensure that we agree with the jurisdiction's determination, we can rely solely on that notice of exemption when DCC does our review. But because there's no set format or content for the notices of exemption, this is where sometimes DCC will require additional information regarding a project, where those staff reports, resolutions, conditional use permits. We want to see that evidence related to how that determination was made. So the notice of exemption of itself is typically a single page, very brief document that provides a project description and why the project is exempt. But then DCC itself will ask for some additional information that supports why that exemption determination was made.
Yeah, so a very fluid process and steps, and it's not cookie cutter by any means, right? You know, so I know it's hard to answer because they're all uniquely different, right? So I think you did a good job of explaining that. Well, great. Well, we're out of time. Caitlin, thank you very much for educating everyone on Ceqa. It's very helpful. I know, you know, it's hard to understand and learn all this in 1 hour, but it's certainly helpful to at least go through the high level and the summary. Obviously, if people have questions, they can contact DCC at the resources, phone numbers and emails that you provided. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this informative webinar offered by the City of Los Angeles Department of Cannabis Regulation. This webinar recording will be found on DCR's website, cannabis.lacity.org. If you have any questions on accessing your account, please email dcr.sep@lacity.org. Thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful evening. We'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.